Hey, everybody. I could not wait 2 weeks to hear the rest of Velma Barfield's story, and Melody and I didn't want y'all to have to wait either. So we decided to drop both part 1 and 2 today. I'm Darlene, Melody's telling this story, and you're listening to Hard Times and True Crimes.
Just like you said, this is part 2. If you have not already listened to part 1, I encourage you to go back and do that first because there's a lot of background information in that one.
Yes, it's a really good episode.
Yep. So in the last episode, you heard about Velma's hard and abusive childhood, her rocky marriage years, and the many calamities that just seemed to follow her everywhere she went. More importantly, you learned about her extreme addiction to prescription drugs. And finally, how a combination of all of those things eventually led to her poisoning at least 4 people in her life. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, her mother, Lillian, an elderly client that she did caregiving for named Dolly Edwards, and her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. Stuart's death is the one that got her caught. His autopsy results came back showing arsenic poisoning, and Velma was the person who had been with him just before he got sick. I mentioned also that the detectives also had received an anonymous call warning them that Velma was responsible and that there were others that she could likely have poisoned as well.
Will we ever find out who made that call?
You are going to find out.
Okay, good.
At the very end.
All right.
So they went to question her, and she admitted to them after some time of questioning and denying it. She went the weekend to work after they had let her go, and then over the weekend, her son had found out that she was going to be arrested, and so he encouraged her to turn herself in, and it was during that questioning when they flat out asked her, "Did you poison Stuart?" And she replied, yes. And then that was where we ended our last episode.
Okay.
So once investigated for that murder, the authorities, working on that anonymous tip that had been called in and the results of that autopsy, they knew that there were likely others, and they realized Velma could be a serial killer. Because at this point now, they only know about Stuart.
Oh, okay.
We know about the others because I've told you. But they only knew about Stuart and that somebody had said there may be others.
Okay.
So they were starting to realize, oh, maybe she's a serial killer. They began to research those other deaths of people who had been around Velma in their last dying moments.
Turning up dead.
Exactly. And so while they're researching that, they go ahead, they charge her with first-degree murder in his death. And so she's sitting in jail. She's awaiting her trial. And so she's got hardly any access to her pills anymore. And she's got a lot of time to think, but not a lot of drugs in her system. They are still giving her some because she's going through withdrawals.
Okay.
And she got so sick that they had to kind of wean her down off of it.
Right.
But she does not have the amount that she had in her system. So she's starting to have withdrawals, but she's also starting to be able to think a little bit more clearly when she's not having those withdrawals. And she is angry, bitter, and she just hates the world.
Who is she angry at?
Her mother, her childhood growing up, just everybody in her life that she thinks has wronged her.
Okay.
She's playing a little bit of a victim mentality there, if you can imagine that. Yep. And she says at this time she actually does not try to kill herself for some reason, although many times before she had. But she said for some reason she didn't want to live, but she didn't attempt suicide during that time, which was odd for her.
Right.
Yep. In her most lucid moments, she felt guilty, and then at other times, she felt sorry for herself. And then a turning point in her life came. She had been arrested in March of 1978, and by July was really struggling with being in jail, being isolated, and all of that withdrawal. One evening, she was sitting in her cell, and the guard had on the radio. Velma could hear it from her cell, and it was on a gospel station. And as she sat there, halfway listening, her guilt just hit her full on. She started remembering and reliving every terrible thing she had ever done. And as she lay on her bunk, wanting to die, an evangelist came on the radio, and he began sharing the gospel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it just pierced her very soul.
Wow.
Those were her words. And now she knew the gospel. I had told you she had been to church. At one point, she was even teaching Sunday school. So it wasn't new to her. She knew all the right things to say and believe. But this time, she claimed it was different. Everything she had ever learned about Christianity came back to her mind. And now she says she just grasped it and fully understood it. And she realized she could be forgiven for everything, and it just wrecked her. She said she was just a mess. And she details a conversion experience that night of confession and repentance, forgiveness. And I can't do that justice,
Wow.
But you should read her book if you want to get that full story. And I'm going to put the title to it in the show notes, and I'm going to reference it again at the end of the episode. Okay, Darlene, we have to talk about this a little bit.
Okay.
So we've all heard of an inmate's sudden urge to repent once they're locked up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That phenomenon is sometimes called jailhouse religion.
Yes.
Or jailhouse Jesus, I've heard it called.
Yep.
And I'm sure there are many cases of that happening. Some of them are, probably most of them are put on.
Right.
But others may be legit. So it's probably not surprising to hear that Velma had an experience.
Sure.
Like that. And if you're from the Bible Belt or familiar with it, you've probably heard those terms of repentance and getting saved before. Maybe you had the same drug problem I had. I was drugged to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, drugged again on Wednesday night. Have you ever heard that joke?
Yes.
Yeah.
My kids were too.
Yeah, mine too. My kids were. But that's definitely different than Velma's drug problem, right? But if you had that experience, then you know all of those terms. Just like she said, she knew all of the right things to say and believe.
Yes.
Well, sometimes the jailhouse religion is a manipulation tactic. People, use it to try to get a lighter sentence or to garner sympathy from churches, family, other inmates. So when people that are in trouble make those claims, they're not always taken seriously, and rightfully so, right?
Yeah.
We do know that the Bible says a person who comes to Christ becomes a new creature.
Yes.
That's the conversion part. But it also says that we should examine the fruit of a person's life to see if what they're saying is true.
Absolutely.
And lines up with what they're claiming.
Right.
So, it's wise to not just believe everything at face value if somebody's claiming it. Remember, Velma had been a master at manipulation, all for many years.
Sure.
So it stands to reason there are some who would not readily believe her conversion claims. I personally found her story very compelling, and we're going to dig into that a little later because it does end up playing a big part in the whole case.
Okay. And sometimes I believe that it is real. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of times these prisoners are stripped of everything, and they can see
right, because
see the light
when they don't have all of that influence around them, and they're just there with nothing to face but all of their choices.
Right. And then of course, there's Jesus,
right,
who offers salvation, despite. And that doesn't mean they get to escape the consequences, but
right. And that's the part we're actually going to talk about
Okay.
at the end. Yep. So back to Velma's version of the story. Velma said that night she began to confess everything she had done, just in her bunk by herself. And for the first time in 43 years, she felt forgiven, loved by God, and not alone. She describes in her book a slow process of growing in her faith as she read her Bible more and studied. And she actually wrote to the Billy Graham Association, and so they sent her some reading materials. But it was a process, sometimes a slow one, yeah. And there were actually some crimes that she hadn't committed, or that she had committed but not confessed to.
Okay.
And some stories in which the details changed. And so we're not sure if she was deliberately being deceptive or if her memory just had holes in it from all the drugs.
Okay.
Okay. And we will talk about that some more later, too, as well.
That's possible. I mean,
oh, yeah,
she
definitely.
was very drugged up.
She
a
had
lot.
taken so many prescription drugs over the years.
Sure.
Yeah. It took her a very long while to get completely clean and off of them.
Okay.
Well, the DA in Velma's case was a man named Joe Britt, whom the media tagged as the world's deadliest prosecutor because of his percentage of death sentences that he had won. Actually, believe it or not, he was called that by the Guinness Book of World Records.
Oh, gracious.
Yeah, that's probably the worst situation for Velma, worst case scenario. And maybe the best case scenario for the families of the victims who wanted to see justice for their loved ones, right? Mm-hmm. So he charged Velma with murder in the first degree, and she pled not guilty due to insanity. And that was only for Stewart's murder. They did find out about other victims, but she had not been charged in any of those other deaths. So although the authorities had discovered her mother's death and Dolly Edwards so far, she wasn't charged with those because North Carolina's death penalty had only recently been reinstated, and Stewart was the only one she had killed since then. The prosecutor knew if he did not win a death sentence in Stewart's case, then he could go back and charge her in the other deaths and probably one by one get concurrent life sentences. Oh. So that was kind of a strategic move. Okay. While Joe Britt was a force to be reckoned with, he did have his work cut out for him. It's very rare for a woman to get the death penalty. And on top of that, Velma was a grandmother by now. For goodness sakes, nobody wants to sentence a grandmother to death, right?
No, they don't.
So her trial begins, and just as expected, Joe Britt did his job thoroughly. During the trial, one by one, Prosecutor Britt called the witnesses to the stand who would describe seeing the victim as he suffered through the effects of the poison. They painted a grim picture, and the theatrics in the courtroom were very effective. He called witnesses that introduced the other victims of Velma's into the trial. So even though she wasn't charged, they were able to use that testimony that there were others.
Okay.
And I was surprised by that.
He was a shark.
He was. I was surprised he was able to do that because she hadn't been charged. But again, I mean, he was a good lawyer. He knew what he was doing. He brought in witnesses who testified to her addiction and her pattern of forging checks. I mean, it just went on and on. And some of that descriptive testimony was just very impactful, just by the way it was presented. And then came the day when her own attorney called her to the stand. Many times we don't see a defendant testify on their own case.
Right.
It's not usually a good idea.
Yeah.
But once that happens, then she's going to be cross-examined.
Oh, okay.
Right?
I'm nervous for her.
Right. So her attorney felt like it was just a last-ditch effort. He felt like they had no choice but to get her on the stand so that she could describe that she wasn't trying to murder, that she was just trying to make her victims sick. And he took a gamble because he felt like there was so much damage done, he didn't know what else he could do.
Right. The evidence was just there.
Yeah, it was overwhelming. So things looked really bad for Velma, and they knew that the prosecutor would probably rip her to shreds on the stand, which he did. And that did not go well for Velma. He was actually able to, time and time again, skillfully lead her into dialogue that would quickly get her agitated. She would get frustrated on the stand, and it was not a good look for her. The newspaper accounts of that trial during that time describe her being argumentative with him on the stand, kind of smart off to him, making kind of ugly faces, like, oh, wow. You know, it was just...
I think of Amber Heard.
Yeah.
When
I can imagine. Yes.
Like they were, you know, whenever the lawyers would get her so mad and she would.
And you could read it all over her
Yes.
face. Well, that was exactly how it was with Velma. You could read it on her face. And that was not a good look for her to the jury. They could see, and she just came across as like cold and cantankerous.
Okay.
And calculating. And so...
And he knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing.
He was bringing it out.
He was. And that's not what you want the jury to see when they hold your life in their hands.
Right.
So when the trial was complete, the jury deliberated for just 3 hours. Margie Velma Bullard Barfield was found guilty of murder in the first degree, and the jury did indeed recommend the death penalty.
Oh, wow.
And Velma would soon become known as the death row granny.
Okay.
She was taken to North Carolina Correctional Institute for Women in Raleigh. Now, in North Carolina, there is an automatic appeals process, and Velma's case began that process immediately.
Okay.
She actually could not have stopped it, even if she wanted to. And at that point, she said that she was ready for her sentence, so she didn't really care. She was ready to die, and she didn't really care if that appeals process didn't work at that point. And she actually started talking to the press, and she made some comments that could actually really hurt her case. So her attorney actually had to write her and ask her to stop giving interviews. Don't do that anymore because it's making his job that much harder. He's trying to do his best job for her.
Sure.
During that appeals process. And she's kind of messing that up.
Okay.
And she actually reached out to Stewart's daughter and wrote a letter of apology, but she didn't hear anything back. And so he actually had to tell her, don't do that, because any admission of guilt is going to
be used against you.
Exactly. So she had to stop doing that. But a short time after that, she started grasping onto her newfound faith to get her through those really dark days. She was still going through withdrawal, which is what she formerly used to get her through her dark times, was her pills. And now that she didn't have those, her mind was becoming more clear. And she began reading and studying her Bible more because she has got a lot of time on her hands. She was listening to preaching on radio broadcasts. She was starting to be noticed. Those around her, other inmates, and even the staff at the prisons were starting to notice just her compassion-like demeanor.
Wow, okay.
Instead of that cold, cantankerous woman that was on the stand during the trial, they see a different side of Velma. She's starting to help some of these younger women who come into the prison who had such a bad home life. Some of them couldn't read. They would come in there and they would be just despondent because they made some choices that really upended their lives. And she's trying to encourage them, taking them under her wing.
Wow.
Yeah. So she's undergoing some changes of her own.
So we're seeing some fruit.
We are. Yes, exactly. So since she could no longer write those letters to the victim's family, one of her chaplains suggested that she go ahead and write the letters of apology to all of the victims and their or to the families of the victims, rather. And he would hold those for her. And she asked him to hold them until she was either dead or if and when she died was the agreement.
I love that, and I'm glad to hear that, because so often you hear that these people are not, they're not repentant, like they're not apologetic, but I guess in some cases they can't be. So
right, because
that's helpful to know.
Right, because like I said, her attorney said you cannot do that.
Okay.
Right. So she was actually assigned a pastor in prison, and he could visit with her and give her communion, and he could counsel her while she waited for her case to make it through that appeals process. His name was Hugh Hoyle, and he didn't shy away from the fact that he was not against the death penalty. He told Velma that. According to the book Death Sentence by Jerry Bledsoe, Velma said she didn't mind that because she had always been for it herself.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. Brother Hoyle, as she called him, really walked with her through a deep study of the scriptures, kind of like discipling her. And she began to feel like a new purpose for life. And now all of a sudden,
gives me chills.
Yeah, I know. And now all of a sudden she does want to live. Now she's kind of hoping that appeals process is going to save her life, because before she was just like she didn't care. But now she's reached the point where she does care. And she feels like she's being used in the prison, and she wants to continue that. She feels like maybe that's her ministry, and she wants to continue that road.
Okay.
Her team was actually requesting either a new trial or for the sentence to be commuted. But appeal after appeal was being denied. And while she starts helping those new inmates, she became known as Mama Margie.
Oh.
Now, remember, we call her Velma, but her first name was actually Margie Velma Bullard.
Okay.
And so I guess, probably in the prison system, they're going to call you out by your first name. And
right.
She just became known as Mama Margie to many of those ladies because of her nurturing character.
Wow. So she is really doing a turnaround here.
I know. Can you imagine being somebody who you're a caregiver for elderly people, poisoning them, to now you're a caregiver and nurturing and being like a mama to these younger girls in this prison system? It's just a difference of night and day.
It really is.
As Velma's execution date grew closer and each appeal denied, it became apparent that clemency was her last hope. A committee was even formed, the Margie Velma Barfield Support Committee, and they worked tirelessly to get a petition for clemency. They printed up brochures, they talked with the media, they spoke to friends and family on her behalf. Staff in the prison would write letters on her behalf. The clergy people would write letters trying to support her. That was the letter writing support campaign that they did. One of the brochures that they were passing around says, and this is a quote, she does not yet even now presume to ask for forgiveness or freedom, just her life.
Okay.
So she figured she would spend the rest of her life in prison. She just wanted not to have to face that death penalty. I did read that the victims' families, they were concerned that if she did not face the death penalty and got life in prison, that she would come up for parole and would get out. And they felt like that if she got out, then she was capable
could be a danger.
of,
And that's a legitimate concern, because some people do really well in prison and then get out and commit atrocious crimes all over again.
Exactly. And, in prison, she doesn't actually have access to her drugs.
Exactly.
So it's easy to think clearly and do all of that. But if you get out and then you relapse and then you're back under the influence of that same thing that you say caused your mind not to think clearly.
Right. Yeah. And it does happen. You think, oh, these people are not going to get out on parole. Like the board would never let that happen, but it happens.
Yes. Right.
So I can see the family's concern there.
Right. And so we can't forget the victims here. And I have to note that they also had their own campaign in order to keep her on death row. The People Assisting Victims group was working hard to try to make sure that justice was given in this case.
Okay.
And you can't blame them.
No.
This case got so much media attention, and it seemed at times that Velma was being pitied while the victims themselves were being forgotten.
And if that were my dad, that would be hard.
Absolutely.
Or yeah. That would, I get it.
Yep. And so Stewart's daughter, Alice, she worked tirelessly to keep the facts of the case front and center and to remind the public that Velma had always acted religious, even in the past.
Oh, okay.
She didn't believe that conversion was genuine at all, since she had seen it before. In fact, Velma had even prayed with a priest over Stewart the night he died from the poison.
Oh, my goodness.
That she'd given him.
Okay.
So Alice was not buying that.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, because, if you've seen that act before, you're not going to be quick to buy it again, whether it's legit or not that time.
Sure.
Yeah. So, but even after all that, the general public did seem to be in favor of sparing Velma's life. Like, I think I read that it was like 4-1.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. After a series of appeals petitions that were denied and new dates set for an execution each time, they kept moving that date of execution every time there was an appeal thing. Decision day arrived. This was Velma's last possible chance, and her request for clemency was waiting to be decided on by Governor of North Carolina, Jim Hunt.
Okay.
So it had made its all the way to him. And he took some time to really think through his decision. And there was a really tough political climate because he was in the middle of an election campaign against Jesse Helms. And most people from North Carolina, Jesse Helms has a reputation. He was very well known during those years. He was the Republican, very conservative candidate. Okay. And then Jim Hunt's running against him.
And that's tough, I think, sometimes to do what you really feel like is the right thing to do, and then what you feel like the public thinks you should do.
Yeah, and he even said no matter what he did, it was going to be seen as a political move from one side or the other. But he did make a decision. On September 27th, 1984, he officially announced that Velma's request for clemency was denied.
Oh, okay.
Velma would indeed face the death penalty. She, as you can imagine, had a storm of visitors after that announcement, which made it hard for anybody to visit her for very long at a time because there were just so many. However, Velma's sister Faye made the decision to visit, and during that few short moments that she had with Velma to herself, she decided she was going to share something with Velma that she had been keeping bottled up for quite some time. Okay. She was the one who had made that anonymous call to the authorities after Stuart's death.
Wow, her sister?
Her little sister. And I guess probably she started feeling suspicious after the death of her mother while Velma lived there. And I'm sure she found out about that fraudulent loan that Velma had taken out and was getting ready to be found out for. So I'm not exactly sure what led her to do that, but she did not do that lightly.
I'm sure.
She felt so guilty all that time. But at the same time, she knew she had done the right thing because she had stopped her from killing anybody else.
What a tough spot to be in.
Right. And she had to carry inside knowing I'm the one that reported this.
And now my sister's
is on death row.
Yeah.
And so she did confess that to Velma. And so Velma readily forgave her, hugged her, and then within minutes, they were crying, holding each other, forgiving each other for everything they had ever done to one another, and just, confirming how much they loved each other.
Oh, that gives me chills again.
I know. It does kind of makes you tear up a little bit.
It really does.
Because it is a beautiful redemption part of that story. Velma also was able to apologize to her own children for the years of grief that she had caused them. I honestly feel like they might have been the biggest victims of Velma. Not only did they have to deal with her drug addiction, the fraud, the manipulation, but you got to remember they also lost a family member to Velma's act of poison, their grandmother, that they spent a lot of time with. And at the very end of this whole situation, Velma even confessed to her son that she had been the one who had caused the death of their father, Thomas Burke.
In the fire. Oh, yes.
You asked about that on the last episode.
I knew it.
Yeah.
Okay.
She had been the one to put that lighted cigarette on the bed as he lay passed out. And she had closed the bedroom door before leaving the house that morning. So.
Oh my God. What a terrible way to die.
I know. And 2 of their family pets also died in that because they were shut up in the bedroom as well. Isn't that sad? So to not only did her children have to grow up with all of this stuff going on, but then they lost 2 family members themselves. So I really cannot imagine.
And they probably still love their mom deeply.
Yes, they did.
I can't imagine.
Exactly.
The turmoil that
was inside of them.
Yeah.
And in fact, her son, Ronnie, he realized, I think I also talked about this in the last episode, about when he was headed off to Vietnam and she just kept telling him, you can't leave me. She was trying to keep him there. All of those incidents of the fire in his room and the break-in, all of that was her in an attempt to keep him home.
Oh,
so, I mean,
goodness.
Just lots of things.
She was playing God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, Velma's son and daughter were able to talk with her about their hurts over the years and tell her, yeah, you did hurt us. And this has been something we've been carrying. And so during that visit, they were able to resolve some of that. Velma was able to sincerely apologize. They were able to forgive her. But something like that does stick with you.
Of course.
I will say her son, Ronnie, for years struggled. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the episode because I don't want to tell too much.
Okay.
But when you go through some trauma like that, it doesn't just magically go away because somebody apologizes.
Exactly.
Even if they're truly sincere and you truly forgive them, there are scars left.
Yeah, it's going to play out in your life.
It really does. Well, while the press had generally been pro-Velma for the most part, and had somewhat ignored the victims, suddenly there was a 60 Minutes episode with Diane Sawyer that was definitely not pro-Velma. Just as in the trial, Velma came across in this documentary or this news report as deceitful and disingenuous. When Diane Sawyer asked her how many people she had killed, she actually answered and then changed her answer a few times.
No.
And then, of course, the clip they had of her made it look like she had this sneaky look on her face.
Okay.
And now we know that news stories can edit things to how they want to spin it. And so I don't know how all that went down. But when the public watched it, it still didn't look very good. And it was not a pro-Velma piece at all. And it gave credence to the victims' family members who didn't believe that she had truly had a conversion either. In the weeks leading up to her execution date, Cecil Murphy, who was a Presbyterian minister and had authored several religious books, he decided to take on the project of helping Velma write her story, prompted by a request from Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife.
Okay.
As Cecil Murphy interviewed Velma, he did not believe her assertion that she had not killed Jennings Barfield, and he told Velma so, because she kept saying she hadn't killed him. Like, after the trial, or maybe even in the middle of the trial, more people, they realized more and more people had been killed by her, and she had always denied that one for some reason.
Well, probably because that one was very brutal.
Yes. And it was the first one, really, that she did by poison.
Right. And she probably wanted to use that as an excuse for why she, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
For why she did some of the other things.
Possibly so. Yeah. So she hadn't admitted it and kept saying she didn't do it. And finally, he looked at her and he said, I don't believe you. There's something's not right. You're not telling the truth.
Wow.
And she had finally admitted to that death as well. And it's recorded in the book that was published, Woman on Death Row, which is Velma's story in her own words. Now, I told you about that book in part 1 of this case. And a lot of the information that I got was from that book written by Velma with the help of Cecil Murphy. So she actually admitted to Thomas Burke's and Jennings Barfield's deaths while she was on death row awaiting execution.
Okay.
So it actually got almost to the very end before she ever even admitted to those two.
I'm thankful that she did, though.
I am too.
There's a big difference to me between her and the first lady that I covered.
Yes, Earl Dennison.
Earl Dennison. She played the victim to the very end, and it does seem like Velma Barfield is taking responsibility.
Well, while she's waiting, she actually has to do some unpleasant things, such as discuss her funeral plans with her family and her attorney.
Oh, how hard.
I can only imagine how hard that must have been. And she was actually given a choice of whether she would take the gas chamber or lethal injection. It was explained to her that if she chose the gas chamber, she would be facing the witnesses until they put a restraining hood over her head, which that sounds terrifying to me.
And I've heard that that's such a tough...
Yeah.
Like, that's a hard death from what I understand.
Yeah, it sounds scary, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. If she chose lethal injection, then she would be rolled in on a gurney and strapped down, which also sounds scary. Yeah. But she would be able to turn her head away from the witnesses if she wanted to. And they would actually give her something to put her to sleep before the execution actually happened. She chose the lethal injection. And the day came that she was transferred to Central Prison for the procedure because the Women's Correctional Center didn't have a death row. Like we said, women don't typically get sentenced to death.
Right.
While there, Velma spent the next few days reading her Bible, writing notes to people, listening to hymns, sleeping, and having a few visitors, one of which was Ann Lotz. That's Billy and Ruth Graham's daughter.
Yes, okay.
Yep. She actually was a real encouragement to Velma during those last months of her life.
The Grahams are just so compassionate.
They are.
They're remarkable people.
They really are. The prison staff found her in good spirits. She seemed full of compassion and love, even for the ones who wanted her to be executed. They said at times they thought she was in better spirits than anybody around her.
Goodness.
even though she was on death row. Most everyone who spent time with her were quick to sing her praises for her sweet spirit, her kindness, and her compassion. And that's why so many people did feel that her conversion was indeed sincere, and they did fight really hard for her. Even the prison officials seemed to believe in and support her.
Okay, yeah. I had read something. I didn't read much about this case because I wanted to hear it, today.
Yeah.
But I did read that the matron of the prison really loved her and cared for her. And I don't know if I told you this, but I know that they were not going to let her wear a bra during her execution. Like, they were going to take her out, and she felt like, she did not want that. Like, she just felt like that was kind of taking her dignity away. And so she talked to the matron, and the matron really went to bat for her and was like, look, she's losing her life. She's paying.
Oh, wow.
She really fought for her to be able to wear a bra, which, that seems like such a small thing, but
I guess if you're on death row, that's not a small thing. That's a huge thing if you think about it. Because I can see that. This is an emotional story, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, even in the warden, he sent her 2 Kit Kat bars on her last day because those were her favorite. Oh. And she had made a comment before that those were not available in the canteen. And so he sent 2 of them up to her.
Oh.
So again, that just shows most everybody at the prison really, really liked her and felt that she was sincere. They didn't feel like she was just manipulating them at that point. Brother Hoyle brought the letters that Velma had written to her victims way back. Remember when I told you at the beginning when they made her stop? Mm-hmm. And he gave her time to review those letters and make any changes that she wanted to make and update them with the current date so that he could give those to the victims' families.
Oh, good.
And in those letters, she does admit her guilt and gives her apologies and asks for forgiveness. And to my knowledge, does not try to make any excuses for her behavior or, and I haven't seen the contents of the letter, but from her words, it didn't sound like that's what she did. So I'm just basing that on what she has told. On her very last day, she was permitted to have a long visit with her children, which, as you can imagine, was filled with some pretty intense emotions from everybody. She was brought a rather large supper with dessert and touched none of it. Now, again, compare that to your episode about Earl Dennison.
She ate it all.
She ate every bite. And you said you wouldn't have been able to eat because you would have been so nervous. I don't know if that's what was going on with Velma, but she didn't touch it. But later on, she did request from the canteen some cheese doodles and a Coke.
Oh,
and so she ate those. At this point, it was noted that while everyone around her seemed to be struggling, Velma seemed to have accepted her sentence and was calmer than most. She did request to be given communion again, and that was arranged for her, and they said she had already had it like the day before, but since it was after midnight, they let her have it again.
Oh, good.
And then she took a shower, rolled her hair, and dressed in her favorite pink pajamas. And I'm assuming she got to put her bra on. Yeah. Yes. Pink was her favorite color all through her life. And she was just really big on she wanted to have on her pink pajamas. As the execution neared, emotions were high on both sides of that death penalty issue. There were those who were waiting anxiously for that event to take place, almost celebrating in the street outside. It's almost obscene how some people acted about it, actually, because even though I'm typically for the death penalty, I can't imagine celebrating it like that.
Right.
And I'll talk about that a little bit here in just a moment. There were others who, although they were in favor of the death penalty, they were still somber in mood about it. They knew that this was serious business. Somebody's going to be losing their life.
Yes.
And then there were supporters who also gathered outside. On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman to die by lethal injection in the U.S., and she was also the first woman in the U.S. to be executed since 1962 and since the reinstatement of the death penalty in North Carolina that had taken place in 1976.
Okay.
A few hundred people gathered outside the courthouse. I'm sorry, not the courthouse, gathered outside the prison. to hold a candlelight vigil. They sang hymns, they read scriptures. And there were opponents out there, some who broke out in cheers when the announcement was made that she was gone, which sounds really, really harsh.
Tacky.
It really is. Velma had asked for a second chance at life, not to get out of prison, but just for a second chance for her life. But there were some, even though they didn't cheer, they stood outside and they had signs that read, "Victims do not get a second chance." And I can see that side of that.
I can too.
Yeah. At her funeral, there were poems read. One was written by Anne Lotz that was read at her funeral. Some quotes by Velma herself, and it sounds really like her faith was strong until the end. She maintained her repentance, and I really encourage you to read that book. It's a very short, easy read. And I'm telling you, I didn't get through it without ugly tears.
Oh, I'm sure.
It was very, The bulk of the information that I got for this episode, I did get from the two sources I've mentioned. Death Sentence by North Carolina author Jerry Bledsoe, and the book that was co-written by Velma herself, which is called Woman on Death Row. I highly recommend those, and I have to admit that book by Velma and the Minister was very moving. And I came away from that really believing that Velma did have a true conversion experience.
It really does. I mean, it sounds like it.
Yeah, I felt like it. And I mean, like I said, I was in tears because I know that feeling of being forgiven by God and receiving mercy. So it moves me to that level. But even with all of that, Velma's case does present some questions that are left to explore. 1, should the death penalty be removed because a person has demonstrated remorse and a life change?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I'll talk about that a little bit and we can talk with each other. Okay. The second question I would like to talk about is, can we even know for sure if a person has truly had a conversion experience while in prison? In Velma's case, can we know if she found true Christianity or not?
According to the Bible, our hearts are our heart. We can deceive our own selves, so surely we can deceive others.
Right. Absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't know the extent of a person's conversion or the sincerity of it. We can attest to their behavior. Right. We can make assumptions based on that, but only God himself knows the depths of our hearts.
Yes.
So we have to make laws and decisions about those laws based on facts that are presented. And the facts in this case are that Velma did kill 6 people that we know of.
Yes.
And most likely she poisoned at least 3 more, which I didn't even dive into in this case because of time.
I didn't know that.
I'll just tell you the real quick side note. In one of those books that I read, not hers, but the one by Jerry Bledsoe, it says that at one point her daughter and son-in-law realized they had probably been poisoned by her. They were sick one weekend when she was staying with them and had brought them, I think, some tea or some food.
Oh, my goodness.
They both were very sick. Their child that they had with them was not sick. And it was after they had turned Velma down for something that she wanted. And they both came away from that feeling like she had probably poisoned them.
Oh, my gracious.
So, yeah, so those are the facts of the case. Those facts right there, that was just a side story note. But the facts of killing multiple people are true facts.
She was evil at that point.
She was. And we have to make decisions in a court of law based on that. And there has to be consequences for crimes that are committed against others. And if the death penalty is removed, wouldn't that in essence just perpetuate jailhouse religion?
Sure.
If it works, then everybody's going to try it, right? And even if there's true remorse, I don't know what you think about this, Darlene. This is just my opinion. Even if there is true remorse and that person is changed, I still feel like consequences for our choices still remain.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that, if you're truly repentant, then your reward is in heaven.
Right.
But on earth,
your consequences.
We reap what we sow.
Absolutely. That is exactly right. And there are your crime has been committed. There are victims in this case, and they deserve justice.
Right.
Yeah, not vengeance, but justice. Yeah, and we have courts of law that determine what that is. And so we need the assurance that our laws and our court system are going to protect and deter crime by dealing with criminals justly.
Sure.
And of course, we know that doesn't always happen. Our system's not perfect. There are no humans that are perfect to run the system. So there are injustices within our system. In fact, some people face the death penalty for crimes they did not commit.
Oh, no, that's hard.
That is hard.
That would be the only reason that I would change my stance on the death penalty.
Right.
Because there are people who have been executed who were innocent, and that's...
Yeah.
Oh,
and that's
terrible.
That actually, I mean, that is truly an injustice. And that is one of the arguments, and in my opinion, one of the good arguments against the death penalty.
Yes.
Yeah. So after studying this case, I actually had to re-examine my own beliefs about it. I had to really think about that. Like, you know, I did come away from it still believing in the death penalty. I definitely think it needs to be limited to like the most abhorrent crimes, which I do believe Velma's were. And I think it's good that there's an automatic appeals process that has to happen.
I agree.
But yeah, I think I do agree with the death penalty still. But I think we need to be very cautious about how we can't just be out there dealing it out left and right.
I agree. Also, this probably doesn't sound, I don't know, very feeling, but fiscally, I have a hard time with, I mean, we're like financially supporting these people spending so much money.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's another aspect of it. I mean, there's a lot of layers to it.
There
are a lot of layers. I do think there are good arguments on both sides for and against. I do believe Velma's conversion was real. And I also believe God did use her greatly during her time in prison to minister to other inmates and reporters and prison staff, and ultimately even through her book that many readers have read. So that's not to be taken lightly.
Right.
But I do ultimately believe justice was given here, which the victims do deserve that justice. And then I also think that Velma did receive mercy when she faced her maker.
Yes.
She faced her punishment here, but I think when she got to the other side, she received the mercy and the forgiveness that she had looked for.
Yes.
If she indeed came to a genuine remorse and heart change, then that is truly a remarkable story of redemption.
It is. And, you know, 1 Timothy even tells us basically that, you know, Jesus died not for the righteous person, but for the lawless, you know, for the murderer, the ungodly, the profane. And there's no sin that the blood of Jesus can't cover.
Exactly. And again, and we are all the ungodly.
That's right. We're on a level playing field when it comes to breaking the law.
Right.
None of God.
None of us need to think that we're the ones that are righteous that don't need it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up our episode today. Thank you all for listening, and tune in again in 2 weeks when Darlene brings you another episode.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. Now, those were some hard times. Hey, just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying the podcast so far, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening from. And if you happen to be listening from Apple Podcast, rate and leave us a review. That helps us in the algorithm. It's not easy to get noticed among so many other awesome podcasts. So that's where y'all come in. We appreciate your help in every single one of you. One of the best ways, of course, for us to get noticed is just good old-fashioned word of mouth. So tell your mamas, daddies, brothers, sisters, cousins, and friends to check out Hard Times and True Crimes. Oh yeah, and we just started an Instagram and Facebook, so we'd love to have y'all follow us there as well. And if you want to leave case suggestions or just want to drop in and say hello, message us on our website, hardtimesandtruecrimes.com. Thanks so much.